even though slavery was an institution that was embedded at the time of the Revolution, everyone at the time knew that slavery was directly contradicted by the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Even slaveholders themselves knew it. They didn't deny it at the time. They knew it was contrary to their principles. Alexander Hamilton said that the example of the United States would show to mankind that governments can be founded on reflection and choice as opposed to accident and force. Yeah, basically a few people's ideas about God changed the course of American history. I mean, it really does, I think, come down to that.
Adam, it's great to see you.
Good to see you too, John.
Yeah, so it's wonderful to have you here. Dr. Adam Seagrave, Associate Professor at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. And we're honored to have you here at Thomas Aquinas College, your alma mater, especially here in the 250th birthday of the country.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here, and it's great to be back. And yeah, as you said, it's a special year for our country.
You have devoted your career to an exploration of American political thought, founding principles, the thought of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. You'll be speaking on those two figures, as well as John Brown tonight. Here in the junior seminar sequence of our program, as you know, we read some of the texts of Abraham Lincoln, founding documents. And I thought I'd begin by asking you to reflect on those texts, the speeches of Lincoln, perhaps the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. But would you consider these great texts in themselves, or are they more of interest to us simply insofar as we're Americans? And if they are truly great texts, what makes them so?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll say first that it was encountering those texts in junior seminar here that led me on this path of intellectual inquiry, focusing on the American context in the time since. And I do think that they're great texts, and it's not just because we're American that we gravitate to these texts and include them in the curriculum here. I think they stand with the other great books that we read in the curriculum, TAC, and in terms of their contribution to the perennial conversation about these humanly important ideas, right? That Lincoln, Frederick Douglass as well, they're talking about ideas of justice, of freedom, of providence, right? What does it mean that God oversees human events? How can we know God's will, and how can we live our lives according to it? What does it mean to have dignity as a human being? What are our natural rights? What is the natural law, and how does it apply to politics? People like Lincoln particularly, and others like Frederick Douglass and James Madison, and some of our great thinkers in the American tradition, they weren't only thinking about their time and place. They were contributing to a conversation stretching across the ages, and doing so in ways that invite continued reflection, repeated reading, and that reward reading over and over again and discussing in community with others. And so I think because of those characteristics, I do think that many of their writings do merit inclusion in a great books curriculum.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how a figure like Lincoln or the writers of the Federalist, when the students approach those texts, they have on their minds primarily these men as statesmen, as politicians in the best sense of the word, as those who in a practical way contributed to the well-being of this country and its very origins. And it maybe comes as a wonderful surprise that they're also men of powerful intellect and who reflected on the perennial principles, as you were saying. Do you think there's some way in which their involvement in the American project specifically adds a dimension to the perennial conversation that wouldn't have been present otherwise? Right? So is there something about America and the American experience that sheds some new light on political matters, say, following in the tradition of the classics, the classicists and the medievalists?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And as you said, these early American founders and later refounders like Lincoln, they were statesmen certainly, but I think more importantly, they were thinkers and political philosophers, some of them. And I think often about the statement in the first Federalist paper when Alexander Hamilton said that the example of the United States would show to mankind that governments can be founded on reflection and choice as opposed to accident and force. So they were involved in deliberating and reflecting about human nature and about the principles of politics. And they tried to construct something on the basis of that understanding and reflection and deliberation and conversation, which was really unique in the history of humanity. It really was a unique thing. And I think also another unique contribution, as you asked about what does the American experience sort of add to that perennial conversation about human nature and principles of politics. I think that the American political system was the first to apply principles of individual natural rights as a foundation of government, and that was really revolutionary in the history of politics. And it built upon previous traditions and ideas. So I think it fits within and is an elaboration upon previous thinking about the natural law, right? And I think it fits in with St. Thomas's ideas about natural law in various ways. But it's not just that; it's something in addition. It's the idea that individual human beings, because we are created in the image and likeness of God, we actually are a sort of a source of justice and moral norms ourselves, sort of in our very being. That we deserve respect, and there are certain things that are owed to us because of who we are and what we are, and that politics should in many ways and in fundamental ways be built upon that. So the whole purpose of politics, according to the American founders, ultimately is to protect natural rights, to protect the dignity of individual human beings, and to allow us to govern ourselves because we are endowed by our Creator with these inalienable natural rights. So that was really revolutionary, and I do think that does constitute a distinctive contribution of the American tradition to the great conversation that extends through history on these topics.
Yeah, we've been reading some of these thinkers preceding the Americans in junior seminar. So you get Aquinas on kingship, which is a beautiful but in some ways very idealized work, because it's looking at questions, for example, concerning the relationship of the human society to the eternity and the way in which the church ought to be involved, right? And so Aquinas himself acknowledges that, well, if we're talking about maybe the majority of men in a fallen condition, we might have to speak a bit differently about political matters. And so the students are left kind of wondering, all right, what would that look like? And then we get Machiavelli, who has no account of politics from the bottom up, but really it has to do with the prince and the prince's power. We then turn to Hobbes, where you get, for the first time, maybe something of this, okay, this notion of the contract, the people themselves agree to be governed, but it's such a lowly view of the human being. And then you get Locke, who really seems to at least come very close to something of what we're hoping for. There's a more of a sense of the social nature of human beings, more of an uplifted view of the person than what you have in Hobbes. The language of natural right comes up. Mm-hmm. Where would you situate the American founding, the American political principles in terms of some of those other thinkers?
Yeah, and they, this is something they were thinking about too, of course, because they had read all of these people that you mentioned, at least, particularly John Locke, but also the classics and the Greeks, and they had read these books, and they were reflecting on them as they were deciding what they thought about it themselves and how to build the political system on their principles. And so I think, there's the famous text from Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary, right? And it talks about the checks and balances system and how our form of government is a sort of, has mechanisms in place to allow for the depravities and weaknesses of human nature. And so there is a sort of Hobbesian Machiavellian tone to some of that language that we see in the Federalist Papers. But I do think that it's a misunderstanding and a mischaracterization to say that it's only that, and that the founders were only thinking in terms of mechanism and sort of protecting against the worst excesses of human nature. There's another great line in Federalist 55 where James Madison says that, this is just a paraphrase, but something along the lines of, though there are certain depravities and weaknesses and vices in human nature that warrant a degree of circumspection and distrust, there are also other qualities in human nature that deserve esteem and confidence. In other words, that human nature is a complicated thing. It's not just depraved and evil and low and base as Hobbes tends to depict it. It's also not idealized and perfect and pure. I mean, we're fallen, and I think the founders recognized that and had a very clear-sighted view of human nature, both in its fallenness and in its potentials and its pure origin. And so I think that our system of government and the way that they were trying to think through how to design a political system, that they really, really thought deeply about human nature, and that they did follow Locke, I think, in large measure in his view of what human nature was like. But I think they also thought more about religious principles and their religious backgrounds than Locke did. And I think that they really crafted a very sound picture of what human beings are like and what kind of government is suited to us.
Tonight, you're going to be focusing on Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and John Brown. So let's kind of shift to the characters of Douglass and Brown. Obviously, the intersection there has to do with the great issue of slavery. What is it about Douglass that strikes you as an important contribution to the conversation concerning the American political system?
Yeah, so Douglass was just such a remarkable, incredible person. He was enslaved himself, right, and escaped as a young man at the age of 19, and wasn't formally educated in any way. He learned how to read basically from the Columbian Orator, this little book of great speeches and excerpts of great texts, and the Bible as well. He led a Bible study group for other enslaved people as a young man, and so he's so incredible in that sense. But he, without having had a formal education and a really, deep or broad encounter with the great books tradition, he really engaged deeply with some of the central ideas of Western civilization and with the perennial questions of human existence in a really, really clear-sighted and deep way. So his reflections on what it means to have natural rights, what it means to have human dignity, they're affected by and influenced by his own experience and how he came to a personal awareness of his dignity as a human being, because growing up as an enslaved person, that wasn't something that came naturally to him or that he grew up with as sort of part of his existence. He had to come to an awareness of it. And so the way he describes that in his autobiography of realizing his dignity as a human being, and then continuing to reflect upon that throughout his life and speak about it and think about it and fight for abolition, and then ultimately for equal civil and political rights for African Americans later. He really, really, he was just a profound thinker and an incredible orator. His speech on the 4th of July, he actually delivered it on the 5th of July, but what we know is his 4th of July speech in 1852 is one of, I think, the very best speeches in American history. It's his rhetorical ability is just amazing. It's just incredible. The way he's able to move audiences and to make his point, and to use narrative arc across his speech in really compelling ways it's amazing. It's pretty amazing. So yeah, I think he really merits consideration as one of the great thinkers of the American political tradition.
That's so fascinating. I remember the first time I read his autobiography and being so struck by what you alluded to, his learning to read.
Yeah.
If I recall rightly, he picked it up from other kids, maybe. I want to say at a dockyard or something like that.
Yeah.
Picked up verbs and phrases and words here and there and somehow put it together.
Yes. Yeah. And he was briefly, one household he was with, the woman of the household was briefly teaching him how to read, but then her husband stopped that, put a stop to that very, very firmly and angrily. And that was also an incident that was very eye-opening to Douglas as a child. I think he was 12 or so, because he wondered why is it that it's so bad for me to learn how to read, right? For me to be educated. And so he learned then that the key to his own personal growth was education. And so that was a powerful lesson for him, that to be free and to become a free, full human being, he had to read and be educated and think about important questions that all humans should be thinking about. So his story is really incredible, and similar in some ways to Lincoln in terms of lacking formal education and just being driven by a powerful, natural, intellectual curiosity.
Yeah, that's something that's so striking, is the way in which letters, to use an antiquated word, but books, reading the life of the mind intersects with the actual practice of politics in some broad way. That you see that in these two figures as a kind of microcosm of the American project from the get-go. Going back to one of the first points you made, that it was a society in some way founded on intellect in a way that maybe hadn't been seen in the Western world up until that point.
Yeah.
At least from the natural perspective.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite speech of Lincoln's, by the way?
I think his second inaugural address. I think it has to be a second inaugural address, but it's difficult. It is really difficult. I would say also his Peoria speech. I think in Lincoln's Peoria speech, so when I teach Lincoln, I joke that if you are ever wondering, where did Lincoln say that, right? Where's that thing that Lincoln said about this, or when he said this thing about slavery or about the Declaration of Independence? If you say the Peoria speech, it's going to be right, because he says it all there. It's really, so the Peoria speech, in terms of being an excellent sort of catch-all, Lincoln lays everything out in terms of his political philosophy, the main points he's making there. It's a great speech for that purpose. But the second inaugural, for its profundity and its theological reflection, I think the second inaugural address has to be my favorite overall. Yeah.
Yeah, and I imagine you'll be touching on some of that in your talk.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the third figure that you're going to address is John Brown. Yeah. And I don't think of him as a thinker, but I could be wrong. I don't know John Brown well, aside from what everyone knows and maybe what the old song communicated. So why John Brown?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So you're right. John Brown was not really much of a thinker or much of a writer. And he's the outlier here. He really is the outlier in many ways with respect to Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. He's not an intellectual as they were. There's nothing he wrote that I would recommend for inclusion in a great book's curriculum. Apart from maybe his address to the Virginia court upon his sentencing, which is really an amazingly profound statement. It's only 3 paragraphs long or so, but it's a really great statement. But John Brown was a man of action, but he was driven so powerfully by his religious ideas and by his ideas of what was right and what was just, and how God was calling him to fight for justice and freedom in the world. He was really just an incredible figure in that way. And as I'll bring out in my talk later, his motivation for acting as he did at Harper's Ferry and before that in Kansas was similar to the motivations of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. He wanted to end slavery. and he thought that God was calling him to contribute to the end of slavery in a particular way, much like Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln thought that God was calling them to contribute to ending slavery in a particular way. So there are these interesting intersections that John Brown shares with Lincoln and Douglass, despite the differences, in terms of his approach and in terms of who he was as a person. But so even though he wasn't a writer or a profound thinker, he was thoughtful and reflective. He was good friends with Frederick Douglass. They spent hours talking in John Brown's home about abolition, how to end slavery. And so he was very thoughtful. He was very religious, very sincere. And his actions were extremely influential in bringing about the Civil War in terms of its timing, influencing the way Lincoln's election was viewed by the South, and then the direction of the Civil War towards the abolition of slavery. That wasn't a foregone conclusion by any means at the beginning of the Civil War, before the Civil War, but I think John Brown's actions and his example after he was arrested and before he was hanged, and then what he symbolized after that, I think really influenced the direction the Civil War took, and ultimately what Abraham Lincoln decided to do with the Emancipation Proclamation and thereafter. So he was extremely influential, despite having a different kind of influence than Frederick Douglass or Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, on the topic of slavery and political thought in general. So obviously, at the time of the Revolution, slavery is an institution for America, and it continues for some time. You might say it takes a man like Abraham Lincoln and some of these other figures you've been talking about, and perhaps the Civil War itself, to bring that question to a head and in some way resolve it. Would you say that the American project was decisive in resolving the question of slavery, or had that been done sort of at an equal level elsewhere, maybe in Europe?
I think that's a really important point because I do think that the American struggle with slavery was ultimately the decisive thing in humanity, sort of humanity's broader struggle with slavery, because in the American context, slavery it had a unique relationship with American political ideals from the beginning, right? So even though slavery was an institution that was embedded at the time of the Revolution, everyone at the time knew that slavery was directly contradicted by the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Even slaveholders themselves knew it. They didn't deny it at the time. They knew it was contrary to their principles. And so in a way, built into the American founding was both this tremendous contradiction, but by means of that contradiction, the way to decisively defeat slavery by using the principles of the Declaration and these profound truths of human existence that we built our country on. So I think that slavery could be abolished elsewhere. The slave trade could be abolished elsewhere. Slavery has existed, of course, in various forms in other times in human history and has started and stopped. But the way in which it was defeated in the Civil War and with the aid of people like Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and John Brown was decisive because it wasn't just by force and it wasn't just by decree or edict. Slavery was defeated in its principle, in its idea. It was finally condemned by human knowledge, human reflection, human discovery as wrong, right? As morally wrong and as sinful. And so I think that was a decisive defeat for slavery, more decisive than it would be if you simply abolished slavery by a law and said, okay, we're not going to have slavery anymore because it's not in our economic interest or something like that. Mm-hmm. The way it was defeated in the United States, I think, was important and was decisive. Yeah.
Yeah, it speaks to the power of principles.
Yeah.
I mean, it is something we run into. Well, every teacher runs into it, but here we really run into it because we dwell so often on first principles and authors who are establishing or working from principles such that a big test of a thinker will be, okay, do their principles hold true such that even if on this or that point or conclusion there's a mistake, is there something behind that that's capable of rectifying the mistake? Right. And your point is that we see that on this massive scale on such an important human life issue in the American Constitution.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I think that's right.
You're interested clearly in divine providence and the way in which it connects with these three thinkers. Can you say a little bit about what's the significance of this topic in particular?
Yeah, so I think what strikes me about divine providence in looking at these three thinkers is, well, first off, that providence was such an influential idea from the time of, the American Revolutionary era up through the Civil War. Extremely influential. It's everywhere. It's pervasive. It's in newspaper articles. It's in speeches. It's in letters. Everybody believes in providence. Everybody's talking about providence in the antebellum era in the United States up through the Civil War. But then today, and in the 20th century, 21st century, providence has really disappeared from public consciousness. I mean, of course, there are people who care and think about providence, but in terms of its pervasive influence on society, on American society, it's just more or less gone, at least as far as I can tell. And so that I find really interesting and important, just thinking about, does it matter that it's gone? Is it important that this idea be a part of our public political consciousness, not just our, private religious consciousness? So that I think that was one thing that drew me to thinking about this. And then the other thing was that each of these three figures, Lincoln, Douglas, and Brown, they each had very different ideas about providence. Among them, they didn't agree on what providence was, and they differ in interesting ways, both from each other, also from the common opinion. So none of these three figures simply reflect the common opinions about providence at the time in America either. They're all somewhat idiosyncratic in how they think about this. And those ideas about providence, I think, were very influential in determining their career choices, their life paths, respectively. So all of those things I found really interesting, and also interesting, obviously, from a theological perspective, because they invite us to reflect upon, well, what is providence? How exactly does God control world events and our lives? How does God's will interact with our free will? I think it's really interesting to use the way in which these three figures thought through providence as a springboard for our own reflection about this as well.
Yeah, and then not to mention that for all the idiosyncrasy, arguably, it's these views of providence that had one of the most decisive influences on this country and on something as monumental as the Civil War itself and everything that followed in its aftermath.
Right.
It's
Yeah,
kind
it
of
is
strange.
It is kind of strange, right? Yeah, basically a few people's ideas about God changed the course of American history. I mean, it really does, I think, come down to that, because I don't think Lincoln acts exactly as he acts if he didn't have certain ideas about God and God's providence. And similarly with the other two. And they were, thinking about, for example, the comparison between how Lincoln viewed providence and the manifest destiny idea, right, before in the antebellum era, with westward expansion being justified by an idea of manifest destiny. That was a certain view of providence, also not necessarily commonly held, but a view that God had destined America to expand westward and spread freedom and democracy to these other parts of the continent and other peoples. And Lincoln opposed that. He was an opponent of manifest destiny and westward expansion when he was in Congress. and he was opposed to the Mexican War and all of that. So he opposed that vision of how providence influenced American history, and he ultimately put in its place his own vision of how providence should guide American history, and that changed the course, obviously, of events thereafter.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, this is fascinating, and I wish we could chat for a lot longer, but maybe another time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
sure.
Adam. It's great having you.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.